We are continuing to look at Standard 7, which is World War II and the Cold War. This standard is 7.2, War Mobilization. In 7.1, we looked at how the United States got involved in World War II, how the U.S. went from the Neutrality Acts, not being allowed to trade with anyone who was at war, to cash and carry, lend-lease, and to eventually the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, which caused the United States to declare war on Japan, which then caused Germany and Italy to declare war on the U.S. So today we're going to look at the United States actually being involved in the war. We're going to talk about the impact of war mobilization on the home front. We're going to talk about how consumers had to make sacrifices. We're talking about how women and minorities had to step up in the workforce and take jobs of people who were fighting overseas. And then we're also talking about how there were limits on individual rights that resulted in the internment of Japanese Americans. So first, we're going to talk about how World War II required the total mobilization of the U.S. economy, government, and society on the home front. The United States was fighting on two fronts, the Pacific against Japan, and Europe, Germany, and Italy. And so the United States needed two fighting forces and two navies to fight two different enemies. Most of that mobilization of the home front was directed by the government and run by the Roosevelt administration. Even before the war began, private industries had started converting to war production. That would help supply the Allies, Britain, and the Soviet Union through lend-lease and cash carry before that. For instance, like a spark plug factory was among the first to switch to the production of machine guns. A manufacturer of stoves was producing lifeboats. A merry-go-round factory was making gun mounts. A toy company was turning out compasses. A corset manufacturer was producing grenade belts. And a pinball machine plant began to make armor-piercing shells. The entire economy converted to wartime. That's really what's going to help the United States win the war. That is the main thing, being able to outproduce the other countries. And since the U.S. didn't have to worry about being bombed, because the United States was so far away from Europe, then it was easy for the United States to produce all those supplies, while the Axis countries were not able to do that. In retrospect, the speed of the conversion from peacetime to wartime was stunning. And like I said, that's really going to tip the power in the favor of the Allies and help reverse the tide of the war. Germany and Japan already were fully extended. They couldn't counter that effort. They couldn't produce nearly as many supplies as the U.S. could. This is a good quote from Sir Edmund Grey. The United States is like a giant boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. The government also managed the economy by controlling the allocation of scarce resources and controlling wages and prices. The government also financed the war through war bond drives. That's really important to know. It's always on the test. There's always test questions about, it seems like it's on the EOC quite a bit too, about how the United States financed the war through selling war bonds. That was during World War I also. Basically, the way a bond would work is someone would buy a war bond at a certain price, and then it's like loaning the government money. After the war, they could cash in the bond and get money off it. So maybe a bond that cost $10, they'd get $12 for it after the war. And so they make $2 just for buying it. Victory gardens were not going to be enough for conservation during the war because this war is much larger. There's much more that needs to be done than World War I. The government turns to rationing of scarce resources, and it was mandatory. You had to ration. They issued rationing books. Some things that were rationed were gas, oils, meats, tires, sugar, dairy, etc. Because a lot of those goods had to be shipped overseas, so the people over here had to not use as many of those resources. Here are some examples of some bond drives. Like I said, there are always questions about war bonds. That war bonds are how the United States financed the war. There's another picture of a parade trying to convince people to buy war bonds. Advertising played a huge role in World War II, and celebrities got involved trying to push people to buy war bonds. Here's some examples of some rationing cards. You can see like at the bottom, that's for like meats, fats, fish, and cheeses, where people could only buy so many of those per month or year or week or whatever. But the point is that people had to conserve. They couldn't have as much as they used to have before. The war was a great time for women and minorities to get jobs in wartime industries. Since a lot of young men were off fighting in the war, women were able to step up and get jobs. Rosie the Riveter is a famous female icon of the time period, and women take a lot of those traditionally male jobs. That's going to help advance women's cause, help women to be treated a little more equally. Women do serve in some support positions in the military. Here's some pictures of women in the workforce, and there's the iconic picture of Rosie the Riveter. African Americans also get a lot of jobs during the war. One of the problems was at first African Americans were not getting a lot of recognition, and so A. Philip Randolph, who was an African American labor union leader, threatened to organize a march on Washington demanding equal access to wartime jobs. Since the government was in a delicate position trying to fight a war, the government didn't want that bad press of having an African American march. So FDR steps in and issues an executive order that war jobs had to be open to African Americans. Mexican workers were also welcomed into the United States to take the place of American farm workers who had enlisted or been drafted. This is kind of what starts the Hispanic movement into the United States, which still continues to this day. Despite all those unifying experiences and women getting rights and African Americans getting more jobs, there is a lot of racial and ethnic tensions that are impacting American society and threatening individual liberties during the war. African Americans do serve in segregated units and they face a lot of discrimination. A good example of that is the Tuskegee Airmen. Young African Americans had experienced discrimination, but not to the extent of what was happening in the South. So a lot of those men who were part of the Tuskegee Airmen, as they went down south, they realized just how bad it was, and that's going to influence the post-Civil War rights movement. That's what's going to cause a lot of those African Americans to go back and try and get things changed after the war. Young Mexican Americans were often attacked in Los Angeles because their clothing was considered to be un-American. They wore what was called zoot suits. Here's a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen right here. And here's some other pictures of African Americans serving in segregated units. Generally were not allowed in combat roles. Most time they had like menial tasks, like janitors or cooks or something like that. Probably one of the biggest tragedies of the war from the United States perspective is what they did to the Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were put into internment camps, kind of similar to concentration camps, although not nearly as bad. They were put there because there was a legitimate fear that the Japanese Americans that were living in, say, California were spies and that they'd report to the Japanese what was happening in the U.S. And so since they were afraid of sabotage and espionage, which is spying, they put them into these prison camps that were in the desert. And really, that's really a big violation of their rights because they were never convicted of anything. They were mostly never even accused of anything. There's no evidence that a lot of these Japanese Americans were actually doing anything wrong. And so it's a big tragedy after the war. Here's some of the pictures in internment camps. Obviously, it's not anywhere close to what was happening to the Jewish people in Germany, but it's still a gross violation of people's rights. So in conclusion, in this standard, we looked at how the United States pretty much won the war because of the mobilization efforts, because they were able to produce more goods than the Axis countries could, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that women and African Americans stepped into jobs that men had left behind. However, a lot of those women and African Americans that serve in those types of jobs are going to be frustrated later on because they're not going to get the same rights as they had during the war. And so that's going to lead to a later women's rights movement and also the civil rights movement. And probably one of the biggest tragedies of the war has to do with the Japanese internment camps, that these Japanese Americans were thought to be spying, and so they were put into concentration camps. That concludes the 7.2 video. Please turn in your notes guide and take your quiz. Thank you.